What would you do if the only thing your father left you was a worthless piece of paper and a reputation for foolishness? What if holding on to that paper got you robbed, beaten, and thrown into a canyon to die? For Lottie Whitcomb, this wasn't a question. It was the sun-scorched reality of an afternoon in 1870s Arizona. She had inherited her father's freight claim, a deed everyone in the town of Redemption Gulch called Whitcomb's Folly. And for refusing to sell it for a pittance, she was left for dead at the bottom of a ravine. But the truth waiting for her in the dust and the silence, among the bones of forgotten mules, was a story the canyon had been keeping for a decade. It was a story that would not only save her life, but rewrite the history of the very town that cast her out. So settle in, and let us know where you're watching from, as we follow a woman left with nothing who found everything that was ever lost. The first thing Lottie knew was thirst. It was a living thing, a predator with claws scraping the back of her throat. The second was the sticky warmth matting her hair to the side of her face. Blood. She pushed herself up on one elbow, the world tilting in a nauseous wave. Red rock walls shot straight up to a sliver of impossible blue sky. She was at the bottom of a dry, narrow gorge, a place of stone and shadow. The memory came back in a sickening rush, the meeting on the ridge above town, Silas Croft's affable smile turning to stone. His offer of $20 for her father's freight claim, her refusal. "It was my father's," she had said, her voice small but firm. Croft's laughter had been like rocks grinding together. "Your father was a fool who died chasing ghosts." Then his hand shoving her shoulder. The world tumbling, sky and dirt and pain. He'd taken her purse, her horse, and left her for the buzzards. A sob, dry and ragged, tore from her chest. She was alone. Utterly, her father's last letter, tucked inside her dress, felt like a small, sharp stone against her ribs. "The claim is more than dirt, Lottie. It's a marker. A promise. Don't let them have it for nothing." He had died of a fever a month ago, his belief in this patch of worthless rock unshaken. Now it seemed his belief had killed her too. She got to her feet, swaying, her left arm hung at a useless, agonizing angle. Broken, grit abraded her cheek, every muscle screamed. To stay here was to die. She looked one way down the wash, then the other. Both directions offered the same brutal indifference, baked earth, shimmering heat, and the promise of a slow, anonymous end. There was no sign of a way up the sheer cliffs. Her only path was forward, into the deeper unknown of the canyon system. She chose the direction the shadows were leaning, and began to walk, one stumbling step at a time. The silence was absolute, broken only by her own ragged breathing and the crunch of her worn boots on the gravel. She was just another secret the canyon would keep. Days blurred into a haze of sun and shadow, of walking and collapsing. The thirst had become a dull, constant ache, her thoughts slow and thick as mud. She had long since given up hope of being found. Her focus narrowed to the singular, primal instinct of putting one foot in front of the other. The canyon twisted and turned, a maze of red stone. It was in one of these turns that she saw the first bone. It was a femur, long and bleached white as chalk, lying half buried in the sand. A little farther on, a rib cage, stark and sculptural against the red dirt. Mule bones. She'd seen enough of them along the territory's trade routes to know. But they were strange here, so far from any known trail. A flicker of something other than pain moved through her. Curiosity. She kept walking, and the bones became a path. A skull here, a collection of vertebrae there, all leading deeper into the wash. Then she saw it, a faint, shallow groove in the packed earth, running parallel to another just a few feet away. Wheel ruts. Old, so old they were little more than ghosts on the land, but unmistakable. Who would bring a wagon down here? This was no road. This was a grave. Driven by a force she no longer understood, she followed the ruts. They led her away from the main wash, into a narrow tributary she hadn't noticed before. A slot so tight the sky was a mere ribbon above. The air grew cooler. And then, she saw it. Wedged between a rock fall and the canyon wall, shrouded in the deep afternoon shade, was a shape that didn't belong. It was the curved, ghostly white top of a prairie schooner. Her breath caught. She limped closer, her heart hammering against her ribs with a strength she hadn't felt in days. There wasn't just one. Behind the first, half crushed by fallen rock, was another and another. An entire wagon train, mummified by the dry air, sat in perfect, deathly silence. They were freight wagons, their canvas sides emblazoned with a faded but familiar name, Whitcomb Freight, her father's old company. The one he'd lost a decade ago, the event that had broken him. The lost convoy. The one that had vanished without a trace, presumed washed away in a flash flood. It was real. It was all real. What could be hidden inside these silent, forgotten vessels? What secrets had they been guarding for 10 long years? Let us know in the comments what you think Lottie will find, and be sure to subscribe for more tales of history's hidden truths. Now, she was about to pull back the canvas on a decade of secrets, and what she discovered would change not only her own fate, but the fate of the entire valley. The memory of the town was a bitter taste in Lottie's mouth, more acrid than the dust she'd been breathing for days. She remembered arriving on the stagecoach, a solitary figure in a black morning dress, clutching the deed to her father's claim. Redemption Gulch wasn't much. A single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, a saloon, a mercantile, and a livery, all huddled under the vast, unforgiving sky. The whispers had started almost immediately. That's Whitcomb's girl. Come for the old man's folly. They saw her not as a grieving daughter, but as the inheritor of a joke. Her father, a once respected freightmaster, had spent the last 10 years of his life obsessed with this specific, worthless patch of land, convinced it held some secret. He'd lost his business, his savings, and finally his life, all in its pursuit. The town pitied him, and now they pitied her. Silas Croft, owner of the grandest building on the street, Croft's Mercantile, had been the loudest voice of reason, which Lottie now understood was simply cruelty disguised as pragmatism. "Your father was a good man, Lottie," he'd said, his voice oozing a false sympathy across the saloon's bar. "But he lost his way. That claim is nothing. A ghost. Let me take it off your hands. Give you a fresh start." His offer was an insult, but the men around him nodded in agreement. She was a woman alone, clinging to a dead man's delusion. She saw it in their eyes. The town had already written her off. Only one person had spoken to her with anything other than pity or contempt. An old Yavapai woman who sold dried herbs and woven baskets near the edge of town had watched Lottie pass, her dark eyes missing nothing. She'd stopped her with a quiet word. "The canyon keeps what it is owed," the woman had said, her voice dry as a seed pod. And what is owed to it? Lottie hadn't understood the cryptic phrase then. It sounded like a proverb, meaningless and poetic. Standing now before the silent, dust-shrouded wagons of Whitcomb Freight, the words echoed with a sudden, chilling clarity. The canyon had been owed these wagons, and now it had delivered them to her. She looked from the faded logo on the canvas to her own torn dress and broken body. The mockery of the town, Croft's condescending smile, it all felt a world away. She had been cast out, pushed aside, but the canyon had caught her. And it had something to show her. A cold resolve settled in her bones, chasing away the pain and the fear. She couldn't go back to Redemption Gulch, not as the fool's daughter, not as a victim. If she was going to return, it would be with the truth, and the truth, she knew with a certainty that defied all logic, was waiting for her inside these wagons. Her first touch of the lead wagon's canvas sent a puff of ancient dust into the still air. The fabric was stiff, brittle as old paper, but it had held. With her good hand, she fumbled with the rope tie at the back, her fingers clumsy and weak. The knot was petrified. Frustrated, she found a loose rock and hammered at the rope until the dry fibers frayed and parted. She pulled the flap aside, peering into the darkness within. The air that rolled out was thick with the scent of dry rot, leather, and something else. Something faintly medicinal and clean, like carbolic soap. Disappointment was a familiar, sinking stone in her gut. At first glance, it was just a jumble of crates and barrels, everything coated in a fine layer of ochre dust. It looked like what it was, abandoned cargo. Worthless, her hope, so sharp and bright only moments ago, began to dim. Exhaustion washed over her in a great, gray wave. She was a fool, just like her father. Chasing ghosts. She didn't have the strength to search or even to close the flap. She slid down the tailgate, her back against the rough wood, and let the darkness take her. She slept a sleep of the dead, huddled under the wagon's belly for shelter from the night's chill. Sometime in the deep, moonless hours, a sound startled her awake. A low, mournful howl, echoing from the cliffs above. A coyote. It called again, closer this time. Lottie didn't feel fear. In the profound, crushing loneliness of the canyon, the sound was a strange comfort, a reminder that she wasn't the only living thing in this vast tomb. She was being watched. The thought wasn't menacing, it was company. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the desert's night sounds, her throbbing arm a dull metronome. Just before dawn, another sound came from inside the wagon directly above her. A soft, distinct creak. It wasn't the wind, it sounded like wood settling, as if a weight had shifted inside. She froze, every nerve ending alight. Was someone in there? Had they been there all along? The silence that followed was heavier, more watchful than before. The coyote on the ridge fell silent. Lottie held her breath, listening to the frantic beat of her own heart. Nothing, just the immense, patient silence of the canyon. But she knew now. She was not alone with these wagons. Something else was here. The morning light, when it finally spilled into the narrow wash, brought with it a renewed, if fragile, determination. The fear of the night had sharpened into a needle of purpose. She had to know what was in those wagons. Not just for her father, but for herself. To prove she hadn't nearly died for nothing. She focused on the second wagon, the one less damaged by the rockfall. Using a splintered piece of wood as a lever, she managed to pry open its rear gate. This one was packed differently. Tightly wrapped bolts of fabric, sealed in oilskin, were stacked high. Crates of tools, new axes, saws, hammers, their steel heads still showing a faint gleam under the dust. Tins of seed, their paper labels miraculously preserved in the dry air. This wasn't junk. This was a town's beginning. This was everything the settlers of Redemption Gulch would have needed to build their lives. Lives that had instead been built on hardship and scarcity. As she worked her way deeper into the wagon's interior, her hand brushed against a long, heavy object wrapped in greased leather. She carefully unwrapped it. A rifle. A brand new Winchester, its woodstock smooth and cool in her hand. Beside it was a box of cartridges. She had never fired a gun in her life, but the solid weight of it was a comfort. She was no longer defenseless. It was in a small, metal-banded crate, tucked behind a barrel of nails, that she found the first real clue. The crate was marked with a red cross. Medicine, inside, nestled among glass bottles of laudanum and rolls of clean bandages, was a small, leather-bound book. A physician's log. The handwriting was neat, precise. Dr. Alistair Finch. She sat on the wagon's floor, the book open on her lap. The entries detailed the mundane ailments of a long journey: blisters, coughs, a case of sunstroke. Standard, she turned the pages, a faint hope fluttering in her chest. The last few entries were dated the final days before the train was reported lost. Then she saw it. An entry dated October 14, 1865, treated J. Miller for Grawl to the shoulder. Bullet passed clean. He claims accidental discharge while cleaning his rifle. Story seems thin. Mood in the camp is sour. Gunshot wound. Lottie's blood ran cold. The official story, the one her father had heard and which had been repeated for a decade, was that the entire train had been swept away in a sudden, violent flash flood. No survivors, no bodies ever recovered. But this wash was bone dry. There was no sign of a flood. The wagons were pinned by a rockfall, not scattered by water. And a man had been shot. The story was a lie, a carefully constructed lie. She looked from the doctor's steady script to the silent, dust-filled canyon. An accidental discharge. A sour mood. This wasn't a tragedy of nature. This was something else entirely. This was a crime scene. A week passed. Lottie learned the rhythms of the canyon. She found a small, clear spring seeping from the rock face, and with it, life became possible. She learned to clean the rifle, its mechanical precision a welcome distraction. She ate the last of the hardtack she found in one of the wagons, her hunger a constant, gnawing companion. She was growing weaker, but her mind was sharper than it had ever been. She was guarding the wagons, though from what, she wasn't sure. It was the smoke that gave her away. A thin, gray plume from the small fire she risked only at dawn. Aaron Vale was tracking a mountain lion that had been worrying a rancher's stock when he saw it. Smoke in the dead mule wash was more than unusual. It was impossible. No one came here. He left his horse tied off a mile back and approached on foot, rifle ready, moving with the silence he was known for. He expected to find a prospector on his last legs, or maybe someone on the run. He did not expect to find a woman, gaunt and fierce-eyed, with a rifle held across her lap that she looked both terrified and determined to use. She was sitting on the tailgate of a ghost wagon, her face smudged with dirt, a bloody tear in the sleeve of her dress, revealing a crudely splinted arm. He stopped 20 yards away, holding his hands up, palms out. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and calm. "I'm not here to cause trouble." Lottie scrambled to her feet, leveling the Winchester at him. It wavered in her grasp. "Stay back," she warned, her voice a dry rasp. He saw the desperation in her eyes, but also a core of pure steel. He slowly unslung his canteen and a strip of jerky from his belt, placing them on a rock between them. "Water," he said simply, "and food. No questions." He backed away, sitting on his heels, waiting. It was a test of trust in a land where trust was a rare and precious commodity. Her eyes darted from his face to the water, the battle plain on her exhausted features. Finally, she lowered the rifle and limped forward, snatching the offerings before retreating to her post. As she drank, he saw the faded lettering on the wagon behind her. Whitcomb Freight. The name hit him like a physical blow. "I knew your father," he said quietly. "Elias Whitcomb. He was a good man." Lottie froze, the canteen halfway to her lips. She looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time. He was weathered, not old, with kind eyes that held no judgment. "He said you were a fool," she whispered, the town's mockery echoing in her voice. "They all did." "Fools see things other folks miss," Aaron replied. That simple statement was a key unlocking a door inside her. Over the next hour, the story spilled out. Croft, the claim, the fall, the discovery. He listened without interruption. When she was done, he walked over to the rock slide that blocked the wash. He studied the debris, the angle of the fall. "This wasn't nature," he said, confirming her deepest fear. "This was deliberate. Dynamite, by the looks of it. They were sealed in here. The they hung in the air between them. The men who had died here." For the first time since she'd fallen into the canyon, Lottie was not alone. That afternoon, they began the work. It was a slow, painstaking process. Together, they opened each wagon, cataloging the contents. It was a treasure trove of civilization. Plows, harnesses, books, a small pump organ, even a box of delicate china dolls, and letters. Dozens of letters from families back east to their loved ones starting a new life in Redemption Gulch. Letters that were never delivered. The labor was hard, but it was honest. In the shared work, a silent bond formed. He showed her how to properly set her arm, using clean bandages and splints from the doctor's crate. She shared the clues she'd found in the physician's log. They were no longer just a survivor and a scout. They were partners in a decade-old mystery. The real discovery came near the end of the second day of their joint labor. They were in the lead wagon, the one her father had once commanded. It had suffered the most damage, its front axle snapped, its contents jumbled from the force of the rock slide. Aaron was trying to shift a heavy crate of mining drills when he grunted. "Something's wrong with this floor," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. Lottie came over, peering into the dusty gloom. He was right. Where the other wagons had floorboards of uniform age and wear, this section had planks that were slightly lighter in color, the nail heads less rusted. They looked newer. A prickle of anticipation ran up Lottie's spine. Using a crowbar from the tool wagon, Aaron wedged the tip under one of the planks. With a screech of protesting nails, the board came loose. And then another. Beneath them was a hollow space, about 2 feet square. And inside that space, glinting in the sliver of light from the wagon's opening, was a metal box. It was a simple tin deed box, the kind used for important papers. It was heavy. They carried it out into the daylight and set it on the ground between them. The lock was rusted shut. Aaron used the crowbar again, forcing the lid with a groan of tortured metal. Lottie held her breath. Inside, wrapped in a thick layer of oilcloth, was a single, large, leather-bound book. It was the freight company's master ledger. She recognized it instantly from her father's descriptions. The book he'd said vanished with the wagons, the proof of his ruin. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The first half of the ledger was filled with the neat, looping script of the original freightmaster, detailing cargo manifests and payments. Then the handwriting changed. It was her father's familiar, angular scrawl. He had found this place. He had found the wagons years ago. He had been using the blank pages at the back of the ledger as a private journal. Her eyes flew across the pages, Aaron reading over her shoulder. June 1874. Found them, the lost convoy. Just as the old prospector said, not a flood, a burial. He had pieced it together. He'd found the doctor's logbook, just as she had. He'd found evidence of the dynamite. But he had found more. The final entries of the original freightmaster detailed a massive shipment of undeclared goods, mining equipment, and silver bullion, paid for in cash by a young, ambitious freight hand who was supposed to guide a second, smaller convoy through a different pass. That hand was Silas Croft. The ledger showed that Croft had signed for the goods. Then, days later, filed a report that the entire Whitcomb train was lost to a flood. He had murdered the crew, sealed the wagons in the canyon, and used the stolen silver to ride into Redemption Gulch and build his mercantile empire. Her father had found the proof. "He knows I'm close," the last entry read. "Met him on the ridge today. He is nervous. I will present this to the magistrate tomorrow." The entry was dated the day before he was reported to have taken ill with a fever. He wasn't sick. He was silenced. Croft hadn't pushed Lottie into the canyon for a worthless claim. He had tried to kill her to protect a lifetime of lies, for the very ledger she now held in her hands. Just as the full weight of the discovery settled upon them, the sky, which had been a placid blue all day, began to change. Dark, bruised-looking clouds boiled up over the canyon rim with unnatural speed. The air grew heavy, electric, a low rumble echoed from far away, a sound that was felt more than heard. "Monsoon," Aaron said, his eyes on the sky. "And a bad one. We need to get this to high ground." Now, a sudden, violent wind tore through the wash, whipping sand into their faces and rattling the canvas on the wagons. The storm was on them. There was no time to get out of the canyon system. Their only hope was to ride it out. They worked with a desperate, frantic energy, a team forged in crisis. The ledger, the doctor's log, the letters, anything that could be destroyed by water, they hauled into a small, dry cave set 20 feet up the canyon wall that Aaron had noted earlier. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, hitting the dry ground with sizzling hisses. Then the sky opened. It was a deluge, a solid sheet of water that turned the air gray. Within minutes, the floor of the wash, which had been bone dry for a decade, was a churning, muddy torrent. The water rose with terrifying speed, swirling around the wagon wheels, pulling at loose debris. They huddled in the mouth of the cave, watching the storm's fury. The roar of the water was deafening. It was in a flash of lightning that Lottie saw him. A figure, stumbling and falling in the raging water near the canyon's main junction. He was being swept away. There, she screamed over the roar. Aaron saw him too. Without a word, he uncoiled the rope he always carried, tied one end around his waist and the other to a solid rock outcropping. "Stay here," he ordered. But Lottie was already grabbing the other end of the rope, digging her heels into the rocky earth. "I've got you," she yelled back. He plunged into the maelstrom. The water was a powerful, living beast, but Aaron was strong. He fought his way to the man, grabbing him by the collar just as he was about to be pulled under. The current fought them both, but Lottie held the rope fast, her muscles screaming, her feet sliding in the mud. She held on. Together, they dragged the half-drowned man from the flood and up into the relative safety of the cave. He was sputtering, coughing up water, his eyes wide with terror. It was Jed, a young prospector from town. One of the men who had been sitting at the saloon, laughing with Croft at the story of Whitcomb's folly. He stared at Lottie as if she were a ghost. "You," he stammered. "You're supposed to be dead." Lottie didn't answer. She went to the supplies they had saved and came back with a dry blanket and the medical kit. As the storm raged outside, she cleaned and bandaged a deep gash on his leg, her movements steady and sure. In that moment, sheltering an enemy, she wasn't a victim seeking revenge. She was a steward of what she had found. She was choosing to save, not to condemn, and in the quiet light of the lantern, Aaron watched her, his expression one of profound respect. The crisis had tested her, and she had not been found wanting. The storm broke as suddenly as it had begun. The water receded, leaving behind a landscape scoured clean, glistening and new. The sun broke through the clouds, and the wet rock of the canyon steamed. Jed, the rescued prospector, was quiet, humbled. He looked at the wagons, now sitting in a shallow pool of water, and at the quiet authority with which Lottie and Aaron moved. I don't understand," he said. "They all said you were dead." "They were mistaken," Aaron said flatly. They gave him food and water, and pointed him toward the easiest path out of the canyon. He left without another word, a man visibly shaken by his brush, with both death and grace. Lottie and Aaron knew his return to Redemption Gulch would be the first stone that starts the avalanche. 2 days later, they were ready. They had loaded one of Aaron's sturdy pack mules with the most crucial evidence: the tin box with its ledger, the doctor's logbook, and the sack of undelivered letters. Aaron led the mule, and Lottie walked beside him, the Winchester resting comfortably in the crook of her arm. She was no longer the grieving, uncertain woman who had arrived in town weeks ago. The canyon had stripped her down to her essence, and then rebuilt her. When they walked down the main street of Redemption Gulch, a hush fell over the town. People stopped what they were doing, staring. Jed had told his story, and it had been dismissed as a flood-induced fever dream. But here was the proof. Here was the ghost of Lottie Whitcomb, very much alive, walking beside the most respected scout in the territory. They didn't stop until they reached the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller was an aging, weary man who had seen too much. He looked up as they entered, his eyes widening in disbelief. Aaron Vale placed the tin box on his desk and opened it. He laid out the ledger. "Silas Croft murdered the crew of the Whitcomb freight train 10 years ago," Aaron said, his voice ringing with quiet authority. "He stole their cargo to build his fortune. He murdered Elias Whitcomb to keep him quiet, and he tried to murder Lottie to keep the secret buried. It's all in here." The sheriff began to read. As he did, a crowd gathered outside his office, drawn by the impossible sight. The town doctor was summoned. Lottie handed him a crate they had brought on a second mule, filled with medicines from the wagon. The doctor's eyes filled with tears. "Quinine," he whispered, holding a bottle, "and sterile bandages. We lost 3 children to the fever last winter. This could have saved them." The truth, once unleashed, was its own flood. The undelivered letters were handed out to stunned families, messages of love from husbands and sons presumed lost forever. The story in the ledger was undeniable, confirmed by Aaron's testimony and Croft's increasing panic. Faced with the evidence and the cold, hard stare of the entire town, Silas Croft crumbled. His confession was a pathetic, whimpering affair. He wasn't hanged, the circuit judge was a month away. But he was ruined. His property was seized by the sheriff, to be held in trust for the families of the men he had murdered. The townspeople looked at Lottie, their faces a mixture of awe, shame, and reverence. She hadn't come for vengeance. She had brought them their history. She had brought them justice. The day came to a close in a wash of gold and amber light. From the ridge where Silas Croft had once tried to end her life, Lottie Whitcomb and Aaron Vale watched the sun dip below the distant mountains. The air was cool and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth from the recent storm. Below them, Redemption Gulch was quiet. A few lanterns were beginning to glow in the windows. For the first time, it looked less like a place of bitter memories and more like a place with a future. A new sound drifted up to them on the evening breeze, a clear, resonant peal of a bell. It was the bell for the new church, cast from the silver bullion they had recovered from the wagons. It was ringing not in sorrow, but in celebration of a truth finally brought to light. The sound was a promise kept. Aaron stood beside her, his presence a quiet, solid comfort. He didn't reach for her, but his shoulder was close enough for her to feel his warmth. He had been her witness, her partner, her friend. In the canyon, they had forged a trust deeper than any spoken words. "You brought them back," he said, his voice low. "Not just the goods, the men, their stories." Lottie looked down at the valley, at the lights flickering to life. She thought of her father, of his relentless, lonely search. The world had called him a fool for believing in a piece of worthless land. But he had known. He had known something was wrong, that a story had been buried and needed to be unearthed. The claim marker, which she could just make out in the fading light, wasn't about ownership of dirt. It was a signpost pointing toward a duty. She had finally understood the inheritance he had left her. It wasn't a claim, it was a charge to see things through. Aaron gently took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. It felt right. It felt like coming home. Lottie drew a deep breath of the clean evening air and gave his hand a small squeeze. "He wasn't digging for gold," she said, her voice soft but clear in the twilight. "He was digging for the truth." Thank you for staying with us through this story of incredible resilience. It's a powerful reminder that true inheritance is often found not in what we are given, but in the character we forge by honoring what was lost. If you were moved by Lottie's journey, we'd be grateful for a like, a comment, and for you to subscribe to our channel for more stories of the forgotten corners of history. We'll be back soon with the tale of a lone homesteader who bought a salt-poisoned farm, only to discover that the poison was the one thing that could save a generation.